Everybody's good? Okay, so it's over to the first panel and Madame Aline, and thanks for letting us play with you today. Oh, I'm sorry, just one more thing. Giselle over there, who's Giselle, there you go. She is handing out cards that are going to help us organize you for the afternoon. You're going to get a card that's something like this, a letter and a number. So there will be 26 teams based on 26 letters of the alphabet, comprised of predominantly, I think, six people more or less. And we want you to get to know your tribe, your team, as soon as possible. So during the networking break, your team should be very close because Giselle is handing the coordinates out right now. So stick with your team because your team is going to be really important for the afternoon. Okay? Anything else? Did I miss anything? A to 6, B to 6, yes. Chris, did I miss anything from Algonquin College? Am I good? Am I good? Aline? Oh, panelist. Okay, merci beaucoup. We'll see you in a bit.
Merci, Christia. Donc, nous avons notre premier panel et vous voyez afficher les questions, les premières questions que nous avons posées à nos panélistes. Et nous avons Alastair Sommerly qui va être cette fois-ci le facilitateur de ce premier panel. Then you will see that Alastair will be then one of the panelists in one other panel. But before we start, you're going to also to view two videos from Redit Abidi, who also answered some questions about this theme. So let's listen to Redit and then we will hear your perspective. Thank you.
Policy and practice. And this group is it's funded by the MacArthur Foundation. It started about a year ago, and it's a group of professors and graduate students who are working at this interface of AI and society, meaning that we're trying to understand the societal and ethical implications of working within the field of AI. So that's one group that immediately comes to mind. Another group is the Mechanism Design for Social Good group, which is a group that I co-founded with Kira Goldner in September of 2016. And this group, Mechanism Design for Social Good, or we call it MD4SG, is a group, it's a multi-institutional, interdisciplinary group that is using algorithmic and mechanism design and more broadly AI techniques to improve access to opportunity. So we've had workshops that we've organized at the Economics and Computation Conference. We meet fairly regularly. We're all working on research problems inspired by either meetings that we've had or connections that we've had through the group and so on. And so that's another group that comes to mind. And for groups that I'm not involved in, over the past year, I've been learning more and more about research labs, and especially those located in African nations that are working on using AI for Africa. So we're working on problems that impact developing nations and impact their communities, the communities that they're living in, that they're currently living in. So one example is the AI for the Developing World Lab at Makerere University in Uganda, and it's led by Professor Ernest Mubazi. So that's one group that's also working on some questions that I think are very important and could be very influential in making AI more inclusive in terms of the questions that we're looking at. But you may have also heard about the African Masters in Machine Intelligence, AMMI. It's a master's program. It's an AI master's program that was founded by Mustafa Cisse, who's one of the co-founders of the Black and AI group, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And he founded this group, and it's they're going into their first class this year. So they're having their first batch of students. So that's one initiative that is aimed at aimed at diversifying the AI community and also diversifying the kinds of questions that we're going to look at. So there are many, many others. I think over the years we are seeing increased awareness about the need to make AI more inclusive and really a lot of great efforts to sort of tackle this problem from different ends.
Bonjour tout le monde.
One more clip and then go ahead, Lester. Sorry.
Dangers of AI, and I'm sure a lot of the other panelists will also mention this. There are concerns about accountability for AI systems. So maybe I'll defer talking more about the dangers of AI to the other panelists. But I think we also need to talk about the opportunities because I think there's maybe not as much awareness about all the different ways in which AI could be useful in addressing some even long-standing questions related to society. So my research is focused on precisely this, not only thinking about the dangers of AI, but also the potential benefits of AI to improve societal welfare. And one core question that I think about is what can algorithmic and AI techniques how can algorithmic and AI techniques help us better understand socioeconomic inequality? So, I spend a lot of time in the sociology department here at Cornell, and I've had training in economics as well. And what I've learned through this training and exposure to the social sciences is that our measurement of economic welfare, of how well someone is doing, is necessarily incomplete. And so you might see that maybe we use information like people's income and wealth to measure their economic welfare. Maybe we focus on just their health dimension, or maybe we focus on like maybe their access to education or so on. And these are necessarily sort of one-dimensional measurements of how well someone is doing. But of course, we know that that economic welfare is multidimensional. We know that it's not just how much you earn, or it's not just your level of education or what occupation that you might have, but rather all of these things coming together that determines how, that determines individuals' welfare and how those might interact with your communities as well. And I think this presents a very unique opportunity for AI researchers to step in and see how our techniques can be leveraged to further deepen our understanding of socioeconomic inequality. And I think once you have that, you could then use that to improve on already existing interventions for mitigating inequality. So earlier I had mentioned allocation of resources being one example, right? There might be, for instance, government subsidies that you're trying to allocate, or some resource that you have that you want to allocate to people. And if you know the right questions to ask, or if you're able to ask better questions, then you're able to allocate those resources better and ensure a better outcome for everyone and for the society overall. So I think all of these present a pretty unique opportunity for AI researchers to contribute to the field of inequality and to contribute to better interventions, both in the allocation of resources, but also targeted education efforts to mitigate inequality.
Try again. Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, Che. I know that most of you were at the session last night, so I'm going to circumvent all of the introductions from the individuals here, because I know that they will waffle on far too long. And just say to you that on my right, your left, I have Ian. Ian is particularly interested in the whole concept of ethics with regard to, and law with regard to the opportunities for AI. Next to me is James, or Jim, I think you are happy, James, who is a documentary filmmaker who has recently turned to look at some of the potential, both positive and negative sides of AI. And last, but by no means least, the man who declared himself yesterday as probably the largest cynic in the group about AI, having been through 7 rounds of this is the most amazing thing that will ever happen to education, and it still hasn't happened. We have Chris, who comes from Harvard. So I'm going to ask just one question to the three here, because most importantly, I want to get you engaged and have you asking questions. And so, again, can I underscore, I would like the answers to be brief so that we get time for people to ask questions. But I listened to Radit and talking about all of the amazing things that one could do with AI, but when we are spending trillions of dollars on weaponizing the world, and the money that is being spent on those dollars, on those weapons, would actually put all of the world's children into primary education many times over, why is AI such an important issue for us to be dealing with in the education field?
Could you rephrase that?
Yeah. So I want to challenge you. We listened to Radit talking about all of the cool things you could do with AI, how we could explore the issues of social dynamic, of social challenge, of effectively the rich and the poor, the have and have-nots, etc. And that might influence policy. But when we have such enormous disparity in the way that we allocate resources, spending trillions of dollars on weaponizing the world, when we know that one of the most significant things we could do is to educate people in primary education, where would AI fit in that kind of dynamic? Where would AI have a role in that, being able to change that, rather than in the sort of theory of the importance of AI?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. It's going to say a lot about what we want those primary children to learn and to know in terms of their knowledge, skills, and other attributes. So I want you to imagine that your GPS system gets infused with AI. And so it becomes an incredibly rich database of geotagged information about the location that you're in, not just where the roads are or where there's somewhere to eat, but everything that you can possibly know about what's immediately around you. And one thing that would mean is that we shouldn't be wasting time in primary education with kids learning the capitals of the states in the United States, or the capitals of the provinces, or any of that other information that's not foundational for any kind of higher order thinking, but that makes up a great deal of the curriculum because it's historically relevant and it's easy to measure. So instead, what would people focus on? Well, if you really have a very deep understanding of context, there's an enormous amount that you can do, whether you look at it through the lens of economics, sociology, anthropology, and all the other things that we might imagine, architecture. And the person is going to need to do that, because that GPS is not magically going to become someone who knows how to expertly use it. Instead, it's a bit like the sorcerer's apprentice. It's going to look for patterns in what you're trying to figure out. It's going to suggest things that might be helpful to you. It's going to have a bigger memory than you have, but it's not going to have creative thinking about what's going on in terms of what's happening. And somebody might say, well, what about chess? What about Go? Well, chess and Go are well-structured, rule-based games of perfect information, and AI does fine about that. Location-based knowledge is ill-structured, multidimensional, imperfect information, and relies a great deal on common sense to understand what's going on, all of which are very, very difficult for AI to accomplish. So just a couple more points. When you hook up that GPS to the Internet of Things, it is not suddenly going to become self-aware like the Terminator and wonder why this meat organism is giving it directions and drive us off a cliff. But it can be hacked by evil human beings who will drive us off a cliff. And so that's one reason why I'm not giving up my professional driver, anytime in the near future. Could this device be used to widen inequalities in society? Absolutely. If I'm part of the elite and I have that super GPS, think of the kinds of investments that I would know how to make, or think of the kinds of ways that I could manipulate what's happening around me in my local environment. So back to the elementary school, I don't want to have students learning what the AI is going to know other than as foundational knowledge, because that's John Henry competing with the steam engine. I want them to know how to use that kind of sorcerer's apprentice at their fingertips to avoid widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Either of you want to take that on?
I'm not sure AI has a lot to offer those primary kids. In fact, I would encourage them to turn around and walk the other way, because the jobs of the future will be taken by a lot of AI and by a lot of automation. Price Cooper's Waterhouse has one estimation. McKinsey has another. Everybody's got a number. A number I ran into this morning was that by 2030, between 400 and 800 million jobs would be replaced by AI. So those kids shouldn't be carrying around. They should either be hardcore programmers and get into the game and be robotics engineers and go study tort law for autonomous vehicles. But I would encourage them to do the other thing, and that's to do the things that AI will never do, and that's interpersonal communication, that's emotional intelligence, that's creativity and curiosity. These are jobs and skills that AIs maybe will replace someday, but not in anybody's foreseeable future right now that I talk to. So, and the sort of one-on-one Socratic method is going to be a whole lot better in, I would say, every case than being taught anything by a computer. MOOCs, massive open online, what's that last word? They have like a 10%, 10% of the people get through it. The average number of people enrolled is 50,000. So these are solutions for the 10% that get all the way through it, but they're not really big solutions, especially not for primary school kids.
I love the question that you're asking precisely because it's exactly not the question we were asked to address on this panel. Very disruptive and very much fun. I think there's ways to tie them together, though. But I want to sort of pick up on at least one of the remarks that I think Chris ended with, which is this idea that we should be teaching young people how to use these technologies. And I just want to expand the concept of use in what we're talking about. To me, although hopefully, I'm not quite maybe billed as cynically as you are, Chris, but I have been known to be cautiously apocalyptic. And what I would say with respect to this is I'm hoping that in trying to frame and answer this question, it's not too late to do this. But it seems to me that the preliminary questions that we need to be asking are not being asked at this point in time. So the preliminary questions are, under what circumstances and for what context should we and can we permissibly delegate human decision-making and tasks which were once exclusively in the human domain to machines? Primarily an ethical set of questions with some policy issues attached. I think one of the things that we have to do alongside of getting young people to learn how to use AI applications is to understand the ethical issues, and precisely to understand them in a way that I understand James and his work to be doing, which is to say we have to transcend the paradigm of terminators and these kinds of things in important ways, because those aren't the issues that are before us. What is before us, and what is so much more important than thinking only about apocalyptic visions, and I was joking when I said that before, is that there are a number of mundane questions right now about how equality-seeking groups, about how vulnerable populations, about how people in their ordinary lives will ultimately be affected by the decisions that are being made through the proxies of those who program AIs. And understanding those delegated decisions, to me, is a key consideration that we can't start too young at. So I think that when young people are learning about Socrates and learning about all of these kinds of humanistic endeavors, when they're thinking about the allegory of the cave, they have to think about the shadow puppets in the context of AI being the one sort of showing this kind of shadow humanism and what people need to do to actually orient AI so that it's humanistic in its nature.
Thank you. I'm going to actually throw it open to people in the audience, because when I asked the question, it was really interesting to watch some of you be totally bemused by what I was saying, and some of you nodding. And I'd like to try and get you to push these people with some questions or comments about the role of AI as they've enunciated it, or as you think it ought to be enunciated. Yeah, ask questions of these guys. Doesn't matter, I want you to ask questions. These people have put out a vision about where AI might be, so ask them questions, challenge them on it, pass your own comments on it. Yeah.
I'm just curious whether all the panelists have the same conception of AI. I mean, what is AI for you?
So in case you didn't get that, the question was, do the three panelists have the same conception, the same understanding of AI? What does it mean to you? So briefly, please. Chris, do you want to start?
Well, AI has different meanings to different people, but fundamentally it's about the fact that machines have different strengths than people do. Machines have much larger short-term memories than people do. Machines can be completely logical in a way that people seldom are. Machines are tireless and are not bored by repetitive activities. And you can come up with a long list of similar things. You can also list a whole bunch of things that people are better at than machines, some of which seem odd. For example, people can believe two opposite things at the same time. That turns out to be very important in terms of true intelligence in a world that is irrational. So AI is attempting to take whatever machines can do that people can't and take advantage of that.
I think about it a little bit differently. I think it ultimately comes down to our notions of what intelligence are. And what we're trying to do is give our kind of intelligence to machines kind of in a piecemeal way in these very narrow domains. A definition of intelligence that I use is the ability to solve problems in a variety of novel environments and to learn. And if you give that to machines, then what we're doing is something really pretty profound, and that's we're trying to mirror our cognition in machines. And so in a lot of ways, to me, AI is the deepest look we've ever had at what it is we do and what we are, because it involves neuroscience, it involves logic and language acquisition and identifying objects and all the things we do with our brains. And I think that gives it tremendous power. And this is, I think, why neural networks are in some ways so rewarding right now, is because they capture a bit of what we do so well, and they're really excelling at it. That said, I have a great deal of skepticism about the corporations especially who are developing these tools.
Can I push you, James, because is that also the potential for coding into that way of the machine's thinking, if I can use that in inverted commas? Issues of racialization, of gender, conformity to perceived norms, to all kinds of things that actually, for me, are the dark side of the potential. Yeah, and
absolutely. We've got right now databases that are biased against gender and race. These databases generate algorithms that are used to get mortgages, to get into schools, to get jobs. So we're creating a mirror image of ourselves in some way, and our biases definitely go along with it. And that's you know, Amazon just backed off a project that they determined to be terrifically gender biased. So there's a little bit of kind of self-awareness in corporations about that.
So I understood the question to be a bit rhetorical in the sense that the short answer is yes. We all have different conceptions of what AI is. One of the things I'd like to point out in addressing that is that we often have this tendency to attribute to AI a kind of social valence. We treat it almost as an entity unto itself, that it's a unique ontological category. As I said last night, it's not a full-fledged person, but it's not just a toaster either, right? People have talked about different kinds of AI. They've talked about narrow artificial intelligence. They've talked about artificial general intelligence. They've talked about artificial superintelligence. In my estimation, for the short time I'll have to make my reply to this, rather than focusing on the different definitions of what AI is or might be, I'd like to bring to your attention a fun term that's sort of gone viral on the internet, which is this notion of photonomy by a US documentary producer. And what she says when she describes AI is she tries to remind us that AI isn't some thing that's out there. It's a system, and it's a system, the undergirders of which are people. And the notion of photonomy, as she describes it, is this idea that there's all these human beings underlying the AI system that do a lot of labor, often a lot of invisible labor, to make the machines appear smarter than they are. And whether we won't need to take it as a smarter than they are or smarter than us, the point is that AI is deeply connected to us because we're the ones who generate the AI, at least for now. And I think that's an important set of reflections to keep in mind in thinking about the definitions of AI.
I'm looking right. Yeah, can you grab a microphone, please? Thank you.
Hello? Okay. So I wanted to follow up on something that James mentioned just now and then also last night about the need to, like, AI is so complex, there's such a potential for people with power to abuse it. So are there ways that when we look back at other challenges that our society has faced, are there situations where we've done a good job like regulating something like AI that we can draw on as we're trying to figure out how do we strike a balance between making sure that all the power is not just with Googles and the Amazons and also serves the interests of society as a whole?
Great question. I think first I want to start just very briefly with an example of when it didn't work out, and I use this a lot in talks, and that's nuclear fission. In the 20s and 30s, we thought of 1920s and 30s, we thought of fission as a way to split the atom and get free energy, and then this period of utopia would follow, but instead we incinerated 2 cities full of people, and then we had a gun in our own heads for 50 years and up till now with the nuclear arms race. There was no maintenance plan for that technology. There's no maintenance plan right now for AI. A good example of when we have succeeded is with recombinant DNA. I think it was 1973 in California, a bunch of people stopped research and they went to the Asilomar Conference Center. And if you look up the Asilomar, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but the Asilomar rules were about DNA, and there are simple things like don't track the DNA out on your shoes from the labs and don't pollute the environment. And those rules have been upgraded and modified down the years, and they've really provided good guidelines. A couple of years ago, a group in the United States called the Future of Life Institute recreated some Asilomar rules for AI, and they're worth looking up. They're called the Future of Life Institute, and they got a bunch of people together at Asilomar and did it again. So I think, yes, we have succeeded with dangerous technologies. We've actually relinquished some dangerous technologies and pushed them away. I don't think there's any possibility that's going to happen with AI.
Can I jump in there too? Yeah, no, I think we do have certain models that have been very helpful. So for example, in the context of privacy, there are data protection principles which have gone global. Canada has enacted its own legislation as a corollary of the OECD guidelines that were produced in the 80s. In fact, that template is often used for what are now being called AI impact assessments. And so we do have some principles, but I think I'd like to point out at the same time that a lot of the kinds of questions that are going to arise with respect to AI are going to be questions which are novel. And this is why my life is dedicated. I teach a course called Robot Law, and it's dedicated to teaching the next generation to start thinking about how we solve problems in a discipline like law, which is so backward looking. You know, how does the law decide outcomes? Common law judges look to previous cases back in history to try to figure out what to do about the future. Legislators look back to the original intent of people doing that. And we need to find ways to sort of grab the future and pull it into the present and think about some of those things. And there are techniques for doing those. We probably don't have time to go into them now. I could have a one-off conversation with you. But I guess the basic message that I'd love to get across is that we shouldn't throw our hands up in the face of new technologies and think that this is just too novel or complex to regulate. That's what we said about the internet 20 years ago, and we learned very quickly that of course the internet would be regulated just like everything else. And so I'm hoping, as some of the smartest people in this room, which are concentrated in the first couple rows, that you guys will also grab the mic and get into this conversation as well, instead of letting the adults hog the whole thing.
And just to jump in very quickly, if the data that's analyzed is available to everyone, and everyone understands how to analyze it, then the opportunity to distort is removed. And if AI does not have to be put in charge of decisions. I'm comfortable with an AI robot vacuum cleaner deciding what pattern to use in sweeping the floor. But there's no reason why mortgage decisions need to be made by an AI when they could be made by a group of people representative of the larger stakeholders who have AI assistants to help them understand the data. So I think that there's a kind of technocentrism here that I find troubling.
Chris, I have Chris here in the back, but just before, I want to leave hanging the challenge that putting the data out and having people analyze it will create a self-correcting awareness, which I think is what you were saying, because I don't believe that's what's happening at the moment in the world of politics at all. The data are available, we can all analyze it, and we continue to see all kinds of perversions around the data and interpretations. Christia, I know you have some comments.
I'd like to draw your attention to the screen. Can you hear me? Oh, perfect. Okay. So for those of you who have been following the narrative on the side, there's a number of questions and comments that are occurring. And one of them I wanted to put to the panel, because I think thematically it's fairly strong in the commentary. And that's the idea of using AI for social good, like using AI for good and not evil. And how does that play out, not just in education, but sort of in society writ large? And I think that whole notion of, you know, what could the consequences be? For example, if, and this is my question, if a country used a certain type of AI for nationalistic purposes that were counter to another country's desire of how to use AI. So how does that play out down the road?
I can give a really good example of a technology that's being used both ways. I know a woman who has a company where the AI analyzes micro-expressions, like the tiny things we do with our faces. And if you put in enough micro-expressions from enough people, you'll be able to read someone's mood. Now she can use that, you know, she could use that for surveillance. This would be an excellent tool for if you wanted to know more about your candidate for a job, or if you wanted to analyze people's faces as they move through an airport. You could really judge their moods and maybe what their intentions are. However, she's using it to look to create a database of micro-expressions that lead to suicide. And so she's using it for social good. And this is the thing about so many of these powerful AI applications. For every socially good use, there seems to be 10 other uses, especially Department of Defense uses. And unfortunately, the deep pockets are creating products. They're not necessarily trying to create things for social good. And the people who are generating a lot of the really powerful AI don't really have the social good in mind. They have quarterly reports in mind.
I think it's also important to say what is good and what is evil, because inevitably there will be a spread of views about what is good and what is evil, even in this room, that is very much based on the individual's perception of those things. So, I mean, it's really absolutely challenging, I think, to be able to say, how could you use this for good? Because not all of us would agree that that's a good use, which takes me back to Ian's comments that there are some really fundamental questions that we need to ask about what are we prepared to give to the technology side to be able to run and manage. Question over here, Lynn.
I wanted to follow up on Ian's. Can everybody hear me? No, not quite
Can
yet.
I think you have to speak really close to the mic.
Really close to the mic.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, actually, there.
Yep, you're good.
There. Okay. So, with regards to Ian's comment, you were talking about how, in order to develop law, I guess, around AI, we need to look to the past. And in education, we do very much the same thing, don't we? We look at to how we learned and what we know, and that's what we teach our learners. Yet the way we're preparing them, by the time we use, for example, in university, we use a lot of research in order to teach them. We know it takes 3 years, 4 years to publish a paper. By the time it gets into the classroom, it's maybe 2, 3 years down the line. By the time the learners get through this material, it's already surpassed, especially in this age of technology. So how do we prepare our learners to be able to shape the future, a future that doesn't exist yet or is about to exist? How do we do that?
Yeah, you might not like my answer very much, but I think in many ways we have to keep doing what we're doing. And I'll give you an example. I don't necessarily mean in the context, well, I do as a law professor, I absolutely mean that. And let me give you give me a chance to defend the claim.
Go ahead.
All right? So when I started being a professor in the late 1990s, there was this thing. It was called the internet. It was a big deal, and people thought that it was unregulable and that we'd never sort of know how to deal with this wild, wild west, as it was called at the time. And there were many of us many people in that debate that were saying, forget about regulation of the internet. That would be like asking King Canute to make the tides retreat. And then there were some of us who were saying, no, we'll regulate the internet. It's not going to be easy to figure out at first, and it's moving at lightning speed. But eventually the norms will settle. And a colleague of mine who's very famous in our field by the name of Lawrence Lessig wrote a paper in 1995. And he was talking about the question of free speech on the internet at that time. And he talked about the First Amendment as it's referred to in the United States. And he said, if we were to cast the First Amendment into silicon today, he's saying in 1995. In other words, if we were to try to write the laws all at once in a hurry, we would fundamentally get it wrong. And the reason that we would get it wrong is because it takes time for the norms to inculcate and for the culture to develop and for us to understand the culture that is developing around those norms. And so he prescribed as a result of that, and it's something I've been very much in agreement with and believe as well, that common law is actually a really good mechanism for dealing with this. Common law is based on these decisions, of which precedents are built, small incremental decisions upon which large changes in society are made. And so that's a decision-making mechanism that has actually served us pretty well in our ability to accommodate new technologies. Not well in the sense of people who are impatient and think we've got to get it right away and write the rules all at once. But it has served us well in terms of being able to incubate the ideas and let them grow. So that's not to say that all education needs to be the same. I just told you 5 minutes ago that I've been teaching this course called Robot Law, which is quite out of step with what my colleagues are trying to do in more traditional legal frameworks. But I think those are the things that we do. We think about problems incrementally, and we learn about them as things go on. And if we're so wowed or overwhelmed by a particular technology, as we continue to do as Chris very well said last night, in these cycles, these repetitive cycles, what we end up doing is forgetting all the things that we did learn in the past. And I worry that the story ends the way that Raiders of the Lost Ark ended, the first Indiana Jones movie, right? They get the Ark, and what do? They warehouse it in a place where nobody remembers anything like that. So we have to maintain our wisdom that we've developed, and we have to carry it forward. And I don't think that means just simply abandoning the past and radically rewriting everything, for what it's worth.
Yep. Can you get a microphone? No, they just, if you hold up your hand, they will know which microphone it is, I think, so they can, you should be good now. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Obviously, you can. So my question is to Chris Leve, and I'd just like to follow up on elementary school education and how AI, that we need to change the way we teach and we educate our kids. I guess I would like to, hoping that it's going to be an ongoing change, that it's not going to be disruptive, that we are not. May I learn what would be the steps that you would recommend that should be done to, I guess my concern is especially I don't see clear rubric around assessing those 20% skills, and I don't see much awareness around maybe teachers how to assess them. And one is what would be the steps to go to that path. The second question would be if you have the power to just erase everything and do something, what would be the model that you would recommend?
Well, first, there's a number of resources available now that are thoughtful overviews about what people really need to know to function well in the 21st century. Not just kids, but people whose careers are going to disappear and need to think about another career. I would refer to, in the last year, Pearson and a British think tank called NESTA came out with a report on Education 2030 that talks about the core cognitive skills. A couple months ago, the OECD came out with a report on 2030 that talks about the core intrapersonal and interpersonal skills that are central for the 21st century. The reason they're picking 2030 is that kids that start in kindergarten in 2018 are going to be graduating around 2030. So that's the perspective that they're taking. The U.S. National Research Council report from 2012 on education for life and work in the 21st century is another good overview. And all of these reports are saying pretty much the same thing, which is that there are human skills that machines don't do well, and we need to focus on preparing people for a division of labor in which they partner with tools that do the things that people don't do well, and allow people to do much more. So what would I change? I think that things like Montessori education, which goes back 100 years, are a really good place to start. It's personalized, and you hear a lot of talk about personalization now. In Chicago, Leap Innovations has a very good framework for personalized learning that emphasizes student agency, because how you learn how to be creative and how to have initiative and how to do leadership and how to handle conflict resolution and how to work with other people is to start doing it, and to start doing it when you're very, very young. And the technologies can provide ways of supporting that, even though skilled teachers are always going to be at the heart of it. I think the biggest problem in education is not that we can't keep up with the research, but that we don't follow anything that's in it. In the year 2000, the U.S. National Research Council published its second most popular report ever called How People Learn. And in 2005, they published How Students Learn in science, mathematics, and history, pointing out that those three are completely different. And a month ago, they published How People Learn version 2.0, which brings in much that's happened in neuroscience and much that's happened in understanding culture, sense how people learn were published. So the principles are all there. What we need to do is all there. The problem is that we're not doing it, and AI cannot fix that, but we can.
Can I go further, Chris, and say that I think the systems are set up so that we beat out of the older students all of those inventive things that we were teaching in the Montessori type education, so that they become, and I'm going to use the term, much more white male thinking in the way that they behave, which is one of the reasons why we have still a glass ceiling for women being involved in leadership positions, why we don't have racial equality in action, because we actually have a system that is designed quite specifically to make everybody the same at the end when everybody thinks differently. I have a question over here. Just stick your hand up. Yeah, you should be good.
I have a comment and a question. I think that coming back to the 21st century skills and listening to Chris and the research, I believe that we need to shorten the gap and have researchers work more closely with practitioners. And when we hear, we need to be doing the same things, I think there are some things that we're doing good, but I think there's a lot that needs to be changed. And we also need to shorten that gap with students. And when I talk about students, I'm not just talking about having them participate in events like today, but really developing student agency. And that's at the elementary, secondary, and post-secondary level. So if we think that all of the ones that are responsible for all of the programs have all of the answers, I think we're wrong in thinking that way. And I think that students, whether they be at the elementary or post-secondary education, have some answers for us to be working with. And when we talk about 21st century skills, I mean, we have in our board grade 1 students doing coding. And so when they're coming to the university, and I'm going to put my mother hat on, I have 2 students that are at university, and I won't mention which ones, it's 2 universities, and one is at college. And the one in university, because I will ask questions, of course, I'm an educator in innovation, so I will ask questions. And my oldest one in university just had an exam not too long ago, and he doesn't always go to his class. And I says, well, why not? Aren't you interested? And I said, well, they're just reading the slide. And so he read the slide, and he got an A on his exam and not being in the classroom. So I think there's a different way of teaching at all levels, whether they be in grade 1 or at the university or 4th year program university. So I think there's a lot of things that we need to change. We're doing it where we are with the French Catholic Board. And the thing is, the 21st century skills is what you need to foster and develop. So with our students, whether they're 4-year-olds or 18-year-olds, we develop critical thinking, and we've been developing this for over 7 years. It's not about the technology. We're talking about AI today. We'll be talking about something else at lunchtime. So I think that we really need to ponder about the skills that we need to develop in students, no matter what age they are, and no matter if they're not students, because even at our level, when we're working in our fields, we're still learners, and we're 21st century learners, and we really need to get up to date with that. And I think that we have a moral imperative to foster that student agency and to make sure that we shorten those gaps with respect to how we're getting the students to teach. We need to get the private sector in on the game as well.
Thank you. You actually stimulated the student body to at least one person say they'd like to speak. So go ahead. Just hold your hand up so we can make sure the mic works. Yes, it does. You'll have to speak fairly close to it.
A comment I have is that we do have the resources, but does every school have the resources? I have people from, for instance, St. Matt's, and she tells me that our school is more resourceful because she used to be at our school, Immaculata, and she used to have, we have a lot of funding in our school, but when she moved schools to Orleans and St. Matt's, she didn't have the resources that we have. So how are we saying that students have resources to the other schools they don't have, right? We have programs in drama, creativity that AI can't give us, but students are not getting the creativity that they can perform in creative arts You know, there's programs that students, yes, technology is great, I agree, but I mean that there are departments that AI can't teach. They can't teach emotion, they can't teach acting, they can't teach the arts of like painting and stuff. Of course they can paint, but is there the emotion in it? Another thing is I want to state is that last year in grade 11, I've written a research paper on how technology affects the child on the brain. And essentially, I believe technology is great, but I believe that the certain ages, like from birth to like, I believe 11 is a great age where we shouldn't give children technology, because at those ages, they can develop an addiction to technology that easily. Yes, technology is great to influence them, to help them gain the skills. I know we're a society, an industrialized society, where we want children to gain skills right away so that they can be able to go to the workforce. But I believe that children should still be in a delicate childhood where they learn through going outside, through socialization. But kids essentially now today are stuck on their iPads, which I did myself. But now that I do research and I'm interested in anthropology and sociology, there's a lot of kids that are just focused on technology of iPads. Yes, the parents argue that they're learning through these apps, but are they essentially learning through human behavior? Are they learning from parents, or are they learning from technology themselves? Are they going to be isolated from human emotion? Are they going to be learning from these people? How are they going to be in society? How are they? So like essentially in my research paper, I argued that these children are not gaining the experiences they need to learn. They are learning from a computer that are telling them a rule book about how they should behave in society.
There's another question over here. Can you pass the mic down, or?
Yeah, that's you.
So, I have a question from panelists. That's for the panelists. That's kind of related to what has been said. How do we know what skills are going to be useful? How do we know that the child learning through the iPad isn't the future? How do we know what skills are going to actually help these children succeed later in life? How do we know what to teach them?
So for the last 10 years, my colleagues and I have been building what we call immersive authentic simulations. For the middle school, we've built 3 curricula that involve students being ecosystem scientists. So they might be sitting in a middle school classroom in the middle of the winter, but through a technology interface that's like an internet game, they're at a pond together in the middle of the summer trying to figure out why all the fish died at the pond. And it's authentic. It's not a game. It's an opportunity to behave as an ecosystem scientist and do the things that ecosystem scientists do. And what we found, not surprisingly, is that when you support them properly, all middle school students can function at upper high school or even lower college level in terms of learning ecosystem science, as well as learning a bunch of soft skills that go along with that. The 4th curriculum now is 3rd and 4th grade. Not only are we throwing in virtual ecosystems, but we're throwing in computational modeling, where you first observe a species, and then you see if you can use an appropriate programming language in order to develop a model of the species. And the kids are eating it up and behaving much like 7th or 8th graders would. So again, you see that with proper supports, all kids can do a lot more than they're getting given credit for. So let's take the things in adult life that we know are important. For example, we know that we're in a lot of trouble in terms of our ecosystems, and that we really need people who can function as ecosystem scientists to help us preserve and reverse some of the very unfortunate things that are happening. And let's use things like immersive authentic simulations to bring those into schools, because that's not going to change regardless of what advances in technology we see in the next generation.
I have a question at the back. You've been waiting a long time.
Good morning. I have a couple of things to say. I would like to think of AI in terms of bridging the existing gaps that we have in our society. One of these gaps, when we start talking about tackling the achievement gaps, as we know, there is people who can learn quick. Some people, they might learn in different speed. how we could use the AI to bridge this gap. The second part, which is socio-economic gaps, we know that the accessibility to AI technology would be something significant. AI could be used to bridge this gap, narrow this gap, but what we have exist now, it's not every school, as one of the people asked before, have the access to such technology. So we need to think in terms of we are trying to solve some of these gaps, but we have to be careful that AI should not be used in a way or indirect way to lift some other group behind. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a comment here. Can you pass the mic down? Thanks. I'll come to you next, Justin.
My question was, if we focus all of our efforts into kids learning through technology, how are the kids that don't have access to technology going to learn?
Well, the answer to that is simply that we have to remediate the fundamental injustices of differential access to powerful things, whether those are technology, whether those are good teachers, whether that's the kind of nutrition and safe neighborhoods that pervade life outside of school. These are things that are fundamental rights that people have, and they will not be solved by making technology better and better. They will be solved by making technology more and more equally distributed.
I want to jump in on that and try and provide a different kind of response to that. I think one of the things we have to sometimes think about is exactly what is underlying the technology and the decisions that led up to its adoption to use it in a particular context. So whether it's iPads in the classroom, whether it's PowerPoint in the lecture hall, there is a whole sort of political, economical analysis that underlies why those tools are being used. And so I think it maybe shortchanges the problem a little bit to simply say, oh, we just need to better distribute the technology, as though the technology is a magic pill that solves everything in that way. I totally and completely agree with you that there are access problems, and that part of the solution to those access problems is to making sure that the technologies that are being used are accessible to a wider range of people, to everybody who needs to use them. But it's also a question about whether those technologies themselves are actually always the right tool for the right job. And what I've been hearing in a lot of the past several comments is, in fact, what's happened is we have adopted as particular norms in education the idea that certain technologies are the state of the art. And we saw this with PowerPoint in the classroom. In the early 2000s, everybody who was into tech was using PowerPoint in the classroom. And there's a lot of us who don't use PowerPoint in the classroom, particularly, I think, in response to the kind of thing that your son was saying. PowerPoint is a particular medium. It tends to be used by somebody who's conveying information to other people, and it tends to make those people, unless it's used really effectively, as passive sort of recipients of knowledge in the classroom, and it doesn't engage them in ways that you said that your son was bored. So I think part of the question that, answering the question that you're asking, which is a great question, involves asking the deeper question of why is that technology there in the first place, and to what extent do we need that technology? To what extent could we be doing other things to foster the same skill set? And then to ask questions about how we promulgate all of those things in ways that provides greater access.
Yeah, and I don't. I've got a couple of kids, and we've got an iPad. But that's a product, and the things on the iPad are products, and no one's really devised anything that I've seen yet for younger kids that's really very good, as it really adds any value to their education through technology. I mean, I think small classrooms with good teachers is really still the way to go. I think when I think about technology in classrooms, I think about the jobs that are going to be wiped out, and what kids should be learning in secondary school and up into university to prepare for that. I don't think there's going to be any job that involves playing games on iPads. Maybe unless you're a game designer, but then that's a pretty small niche. We can't train everybody to be game designers. So I agree with what you said. I think is education a problem that technology is a solution for? And generally, I would say no. I think this is a really good example of this immersive VR, and I've seen a lot of really cool VR and AR applications, but I haven't seen too many good ones for education. Mostly it's about games. So I think maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe we should be asking a little bit about how is education going to have to change in order to get kids ready for a different world without the kind of jobs that they used to be able to have.
But I think part of the same narrative is to ask the question, how will education change in order for us to figure out whether the world ought to be changed in this way that changes those jobs for people?
There's such a giant economic wind propelling AI that I don't think we're not really as in charge as we could be.
Well, I agree that we're not as in charge as we should be, but I think that's part of what education ought to be able to do. It's to provide the students with the kind of agency that was spoken about earlier, to empower them in that way, rather than to be speaking of these technologies as though they're inevitable, or that they stand alone, or like the internet, we can't command. It's like asking us to command the tides to retreat. I just think that I don't think I disagree with you that much. I just think there's a critical layer of questions here about whether these technologies ought to be adopted, whether they're inevitable. And what I'm hearing from some of these guys is they're saying, well, you know what, some of these technologies actually aren't that helpful to us that are being used today. And so although people, think that we're in the 21st century because we have iPads in the classroom, that's not what's fixing the problem.
I've got a whole load of people who want to ask questions, and we're actually at the end of time because we need to be able to make sure everybody else gets space. This gives me the opportunity. I'm ignoring the people over there who are shouting out, you've got 5 minutes and all kinds of things. Be quiet, Aline. What I would like to do, though, is to encourage you to come and talk to the panelists. And although Ian said I began with a disruptive question, I would just like to highlight the fact there were 3 questions that were asked in this session. They were, to what extent does the drive towards ever-increasing development of AI displace traditional skills, knowledge, and expertise? What impact does this have on current educational offerings? And what societal safeguards might we need to avoid this kind of disruption? And I think the panelists have answered all 3 of those questions, and you have challenged them to think about those questions effectively. So could I ask you to provide a round of applause and thank the panelists for what they have done. We now have a coffee break, but I would encourage you to come and barrack these 3 with their questions. And thank you very much for your participation. And I apologize to at least the 5 people who I cut off from asking questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Alastair. Thank you all for all our panelists. And I want also to let you know that the break is on the other side of this hall. But you will see also one of our colleagues under the banner Ideation 6. And if you want to still push some ideas on which we should be thinking of